The Unthinkable Conflict, a comprehensive breakdown of the outbreak of war between the United States and Ukraine. Dateline, Washington, D.C./Kiev. Hypothetical future date. Byline, a synthesis of international security analysis. Executive summary. In a seismic shift that has shattered the foundations of the post-World War II international order, the United States of America and Ukraine are now in a state of open, declared war. This development, which would have been considered unthinkable just months ago, follows a rapid and catastrophic chain of events stemming from a fundamental and irreconcilable breakdown in their previously steadfast alliance. The conflict, ignited by a controversial Ukrainian tactical strike on a U.S. naval vessel in the Black Sea, has escalated with breathtaking speed, drawing in NATO allies and triggering a global crisis of unprecedented scale. This article provides a minute-by-minute account of the initial hostilities, an in-depth analysis of the geopolitical precipice that led to this point, an assessment of the military capabilities and strategies on both sides, and immediate, devastating global consequences. The fuse was lit in the volatile waters of the western Black Sea, off the coast of Odessa. The date was hypothetical date. The setting was a tense maritime environment where U.S. and NATO ships have been operating for years to ensure sea lanes remain open and to demonstrate support for Ukraine against Russian aggression. However, the context had changed dramatically. Background to the flashpoint. In the preceding months, a newly empowered and deeply paranoid faction within the Ukrainian government and military high command had become convinced that the United States was preparing to broker a peace deal with Russia that would sacrifice Ukrainian sovereignty. Secret and later leaked diplomatic cables showed U.S. officials, under immense domestic and international pressure, engaging in back-channel communications with Moscow. The stated goal was a ceasefire, but Kiev feared was a prelude to a frozen conflict that would leave vast swathes of Ukrainian territory under permanent Russian occupation. This suspicion bred a toxic resentment. The narrative of American betrayal began to circulate at the highest levels in Kiev. Simultaneously, a series of unexplained incidents occurred. A shipment of promised F-16 fighter jets was delayed indefinitely. A crucial package of long-range Abrams missiles was reevaluated, and U.S. intelligence sharing became noticeably less forthcoming. To the Ukrainian hawks, this was not mere bureaucracy, but a coordinated pressure campaign. The day of the incident, the USS James E. Williams, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, was conducting what the U.S. Navy termed a freedom of navigation operation approximately 30 nautical miles south of Odessa. The Ukrainian government, however, had issued a stern warning days prior, declaring a unilateral extension of its territorial waters as a defensive maritime exclusion zone due to an alleged heightened threat of Russian naval drones. The U.S. had publicly dismissed this claim as a pretext for escalating tensions. At 14:23 local time, the USS James E. Williams detected multiple aerial contacts approaching at high speed. The contacts were identified as Ukrainian-made Neptune anti-ship missiles, launched from a concealed coastal battery. The ship's Aegis combat system engaged, shooting down 2 of the 3 missiles. The third, however, evaded countermeasures and struck the destroyer amidships. The explosion tore a massive hole in the ship's hull, killing 27 American sailors instantly and injuring dozens more. The ship lost power and began to list severely. Distress calls were immediately sent out, and nearby NATO aircraft and vessels rushed to the scene. The immediate aftermath and conflicting narratives. Within minutes, the world was trying to make sense of the attack. The Ukrainian statement. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense issued a terse statement claiming its forces had engaged an unidentified vessel operating illegally within its declared exclusion zone. They stated that after repeated hails went unanswered and given the extreme threat environment, they were forced to take defensive action. They expressed regret for any loss of life, but placed the blame squarely on the U.S. for provocative and reckless disregard for Ukrainian sovereignty. The American statement. The Pentagon was unequivocal. The White House press secretary, in a televised address barely an hour after the attack, labeled it an unprovoked and outrageous act of aggression against the United States. She stated that the USS James E. Williams was in international waters. Its transponder was active, and it was on a routine patrol. President Name was briefed in the Situation Room and declared, "This attack will not stand." Those responsible will be held accountable. The stage was set for a confrontation. The United Nations Security Council convened in an emergency session, but with the U.S. as a permanent member, any resolution was doomed. The world held its breath, waiting for the American response. Part 2, the road to war, geopolitical fracture. The attack on the USS James E. Williams was not an isolated event, but the catastrophic culmination of a deep and widening rift between Washington and Kiev. To understand how two nations, bound by a common cause for nearly a decade, could ascend into open warfare, one must examine the tectonic pressures that fractured the alliance. One, the fatigue of unending war. By the late 2020s, American support for the war in Ukraine, while still substantial, was showing significant cracks. A new administration or a shift in congressional power had brought a growing faction of isolationists and budget hawks to the forefront. The mantra of America First was resurgent. The financial cost, over $100 billion in aid, and the strategic focus on Eastern Europe were increasingly questioned, especially as new crises flared in the Asia-Pacific and the Middle East. The American public, once united in its support for Ukraine, became weary. The war was seen as a stalemate with no clear path to victory, only an endless drain on resources. 2, Ukrainian ultranationalism and the no-compromise doctrine. Conversely, years of brutal conflict had forged an ironwood in segments of Ukrainian society and its military leadership. The initial goal of liberating all occupied territory, including Crimea, had hardened into an absolute, non-negotiable principle. Any suggestion of a negotiated settlement that did not restore the 1991 borders was viewed as treason. This no-compromise doctrine was championed by a new generation of battle-hardened commanders and nationalist politicians who had